The U.S. is to increase the number of U.S. troops training Taiwanese forces in the coming months. They are only trainers, and there will not be a lot of them, but that was not the point. The point was to underline to China that the U.S. is taking the Taiwan issue seriously, and that in its best-case scenario, it will be fighting a Ukraine-style war if it tries to take Taiwan. The modest increase in the number of troops in Taiwan is likely to increase tensions with China. The U.S. has strengthened its posture around the island, bolstering forces in nearby Okinawa and Guam. In response, China accused the U.S. of undermining peace and stability in the region. This week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said China may provide Russia with lethal support for its war in Ukraine and threaten sanctions if they proceed. China's foreign ministry fired back that the U.S. and NATO were smearing China. The U.S. has had between 20 and 40 troops based in Taiwan in recent years. Most are Marines, who are tasked with embassy and diplomatic security at the de facto U.S. Embassy, the American Institute in Taiwan. The U.S. does not have an official embassy in Taiwan since it does not yet recognize the island as an independent nation. The U.S. needs to deter China from invading Taiwan only until its collapse at the end of the century. Geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan outlines China's bigger problems in this interview on the Jordan Harbinger podcast.
China didn't start to urbanize until 1980. And then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. In the United States, we are a large population, 330 million. In order to round out our younger age groups, we really need to bring in about 2 to 4 million immigrants a year. And we're well under that right now, and that is something that will come back to bite us again and again and again in the decades to come. But we're also a settler society. None of us are actually from here, and so the United States is capable politically of sustaining large volumes of immigration for an extended period of time. Just now is not one of those moments. Immigration can be part of our solution. There's a lot of complications in that conversation, politically, logistically. That's a different conversation we can get into if you want to. But the United States is the largest economy in the world with the greatest upward mobility from people from the lower classes to the higher classes, and the attractiveness of that system, especially since it's mostly free, is robust. And you're right, that when we do decide to have an open immigration system, we usually have no problem drawing in people, and that's before you consider what's about to happen to the wider world, where the delta between the US and everyone else is going to be huge. The United States has over 300 million people. The Chinese have about 1.3 billion. So to move the needle, you don't just need to bring in 3 times as many people. You need to bring in 10 times as many people under age 40. It's not clear that there are enough people that are potentially migrant to salvage just China, assuming no one else moves anywhere else. The United States has has developed an interesting reputation of late of being a little bit racist, with white people being a little sketchy. But in China, which is 90% Han Chinese, they are blindingly racist to anyone who is not Han. And to think that there are going to be incentives that will draw people, especially in numbers, to the PRC is ridiculous, even before you consider the disconnect in terms of economic activity. But third, there's the governing system. You know, the U.S. may be a flawed democracy, but a democracy it still is. China is a country where you are welded into your room when there's a health crisis. The degree, the casual dismissal of the very concept that private citizens have agency or interests is something that does not attract migrants. Yeah, China has never had net inward migration. It's always been outward, people trying to get out, not people trying to get in. Now, there is migration within the Chinese system. People forget that China is not a traditional nation state. It is an empire, and they have expanded out and conquered other groups, and you do get migrant from those poorer minorities into the urban centers. But again, you can only do that once, because then you've hollowed out the countryside, and that is what has happened writ large throughout the entire system at this point. The average age in some of these cities is upwards of 50% higher than it is accent.
Yes.
Remember that there
Waves.
are two aspects, two things you need for globalization to work. Number one, you need the physical interconnectivity, the transport systems that are low cost and very, very safe. The lower the cost of transport per unit, the more steps you can get in your supply chain, the greater capacity there is to expand into things that otherwise would be so low cost that you wouldn't trade them internationally. Things like wheat, for example, or plastics. Second, you need a balance of production and consumption, and that in many ways is a subset of demographic structures. So you need to have a significant number of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s in order to generate the capital and the skilled labor base to produce, but then you also need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to do some of the lower skilled stuff as well as consume. And this all has to be in balance for it to work. The demographic aging we've seen in recent decades means that that second piece is just completely gone. And countries are increasingly find it in their best interest to kind of hoard what consumption they do have and not allow trade access to it, and then producing more locally. We were moving this way before the Ukraine war, before the Chinese started to break down, and before the German industrial model started to implode. This has just sped everything up. As for the first end with transport, there we're kind of we're kind of in this hanging moment where we're waiting for someone to take the first shot now that the
Hmm.
Americans lack the capacity to protect the system. But even if we don't get a formal conflict over transport, by everyone kind of hoarding the production and consumption zones for themselves, we no longer have a vested interest anywhere in the world in what happens over the horizon. And as long as that is the case, we can get regional transport breakdowns that, from our point of view, don't affect us. But from everyone else's point of view, it's a bit of a disaster. And the more linked in your country is to these networks, the more vulnerable you are. So, China, Korea, Germany, very much so at the very top of that list for different reasons, but they're all dependent upon the inflow and outflow. And so, you can damage global transport significantly before the Americans really notice. Not only is the United States one of the world's biggest mining countries for raw materials, so is Canada, so is Mexico. Brazil isn't that far away, and it's all in the same hemisphere. So you can have an Eastern hemispheric breakdown, which today, three-quarters of population, three-quarters of energy, three-quarters of food production, three-quarters of manufactured goods. And for the most part, the Western hemisphere actually does better.